Welcome to the New Books Network.
Hi, everyone, and welcome back to New Books and Genocide Studies, a podcast channel on the New Books Network. I'm your host today, Jeff Bachman, an associate professor at the American University School of International Service. Thank you all for listening. And today I'll be talking to Norman Solomon about his new book, War Made Invisible: How America Hides the Human Toll of Its Military Machine, published by the New Press in June of this year. Norman, welcome to the show.
Thanks a lot, Jeff.
Thanks for joining me. And having read many of your earlier books on media, it's my pleasure to have this opportunity to talk with you about your latest. And with that in mind, with more than a dozen books written and a life dedicated to progressive activism, can you tell our listeners a bit about yourself? What brought you to focus on media, U.S. foreign policy, and war?
I grew up mostly in the DC area, and after being born in 1951 and coming of age and reading the Washington Post in the early mid 1960s, gradually dawned on me that there was something amiss with the Vietnam War. And it was, so to speak, really educational to read the Washington Post, because I could see that while the media coverage was not monolithic, there was an overall attitude and framework that increasingly, as I learned more, read independently, and starting in 1967, started going to anti-war demonstrations, really was askew from other perspectives and information that I was getting. So, like a lot of people of my generation, born in the years and decade or two after World War II, the Vietnam War was really pivotal. It really expanded, while a tragedy in Southeast Asia expanded my understanding and perceptions of the world and really of the U.S. government. I'd grown up in a liberal household where, understandably, looking at domestic issues, Hubert Humphrey was a hero. And so, literally and metaphorically, learning and seeing what happened to Hubert Humphrey from liberal icon to basically Cold Warrior during the Vietnam War and all the terrible role that he played, that was, among many other events, really eye-opening for me.
Thanks, Norman. And, it just makes me think a little. I remember seeing, right now I'm doing some research with my research assistant, also collaborator, and we're looking at the way that politicians and media have talked about the invasion of Ukraine and comparing to the invasion of Iraq, and you mentioned Vietnam, and I recall seeing something where Blinken was referring to aggression, and this aggression can't be tolerated. And I just wonder, and I I want to get back to the book, of course, but I wonder, is it in popular circles, is the war in Vietnam or the invasion of Iraq, are they understood by American officials and American media as wars of aggression?
Really, I think this is, so to speak, a repetition compulsion disorder, that there's an attitude, among other things, well, that was then and this is now. There's not really a lasting sort of set of conclusions, other than maybe let's do our military adventurism and intervention better next time. One of the tropes was, well, we didn't message well. And of course, there was the more on the right wing, the stab in the back sort of thing, that the anti-war movement and the media somehow prevented victory. But, more mainstream militarism and Democratic Party was to take some lessons from it, but the lessons were more about how to better implement intervention rather than there's something wrong with the intervention. Daniel Ellsberg said it really well after releasing the Pentagon Papers. We weren't on the wrong side. We were the wrong side in Vietnam. And I think that's, among other ways to say it, a distinction between the lessons that were taken by mainstream media and politics in the United States from the Vietnam War and the lessons that should have been taken. Another way to say it is, it's not that the United States intervened in an maladroit way, but the United States doesn't have a right to, at its pleasure, decide when and where and how to militarily attack other countries.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Thank you, Norman. And maybe this also does lead into the second question here in its own way. Imagine you have not seen all of the progress, at least, and change that you have sought throughout your lifetime, and the work that you've done. And when apathy is easy, what drives you to keep active and keep writing about the issues you care about?
It's hard to know. A lot of times, as is the case, I think, with people who persist in the arts, in political activism, in writing, in research, it's hard to imagine not proceeding. For me, it was, ever since the Vietnam War, an imperative of just not feeling powerless. Whatever the realities might be, our power at best, individually and even collectively, is very limited. But it's really the reverse of what sometimes very sincerely people say is, well, I really don't want to get involved in political activism because it just makes me feel so depressed and powerless. For me, it's really, and I think for a lot of activists and scholars and writers who are trying to challenge the warfare state, it's quite the opposite. That to be passive and simply be spectators as history unfolds is just hard to imagine. It's just not where our lives are at or where we want our lives to be at. So for me, it was probably precognitive. I've just felt the need and the desire, and a sort of personal as well as macro imperative, to be part of changing, so to speak, the world for the better.
Thanks, Norman. And where do you see, the anti-war movement now? I can say, and I guess maybe another question, as someone who was actively participating in protests against drone strikes, certainly the larger protests, or leading up to the Iraq War. As one of the hundreds of thousands in the U.S. and I suppose millions worldwide who were protesting the Iraq War. And I remember President Bush saying, I think I have this right, in some speech or statement, he hears us, but he respectfully disagrees or something like that, and then invaded Iraq anyway. And I guess, maybe come back to the question, where do you see the anti-war movement now? And did the failure, I guess, if you want to say that, or maybe not you, that if I want to say that, of the protests of the Iraq War, did that have any impact on this anti-war movement?
Well, parenthetically, I recall even Nixon, after the May 4th killings at Kent State and Jackson State, trying to show that he wanted to listen to demonstrators. Obama went through that sort of ritual. It's almost pro forma sometimes. The anti-war movement's really gone through so many ebbs and flows with a lot of different factors, and one is often laid at the feet of electoral politics, and in particular that when Democrats are in office in the White House, that there tends to be more quiescence. And I think that there's some truth to that, but there are a lot of other layers as well. And the focus on domestic politics, which has been generally really dominant on the left among liberals and progressives and so forth, has really taken away the attention, I think, unwisely. And Martin Luther King Jr., of course, was denounced for making the connections between U.S. domestic and foreign policy, as well as morally speaking. And that sort of paradigm has continued in various guises, where we're encouraged to simply continue to focus on domestic issues. It's sort of a modern version. I can't call it Cold War liberalism anymore, maybe Cold War progressivism. And of course, the media coverage is tremendously important in diverting our attention from foreign policy, or when there are incontrovertibly important foreign policy stories and war overseas and so forth. The spin, the slant is almost routinely so deceptive to take away the culpability and role of the United States, to put the halo over the head of Uncle Sam. That is a tremendous factor as well. And even though progressives, we might pride ourselves that we're not influenced by mass media, we are. And there's a migration of messaging and so forth, unfortunately, mostly in the direction from corporate media, occasionally from progressive outlets, and certainly from organizing into the mainstream media. If we were talking even a couple months ago, I would say, yeah, the anti-war movement is really on its back or on its heels. The horrors going on now in Gaza have really, I think, awakened, especially among younger people, an understanding and an activism that is challenging U.S. foreign policy, and that's all to the good. It's belated, and certainly better late than never. The year and a half plus of U.S. involvement in the Ukraine war, I think, has deserved a lot more challenge, certainly, than it's gotten.
Thanks, Norman. And maybe sticking here for a moment, and without asking you to do an entire history of U.S. foreign policy, its relationship with Israel, but could you give our listeners some idea of what U.S. foreign policy with Israel has looked like over the last few decades, and what role the U.S. has or hasn't had as a quote-unquote honest broker in trying to negotiate a permanent peace or a permanent solution?
I don't think the United States has ever been, as a government, an honest broker in the conflict between Israel and Palestinians for many reasons, including domestic politics in the U.S., Zionist pressure, ironically, even in anti-Semitic quarters of the far right, sort of Christian fundamentalists. Some of them are both anti-Semitic and pro-Israel for their theological reasons. The United States has, I think, in terms of its so-called national security strata, really seen Israel as a beachhead or a base, so to speak, for the U.S. military in the Middle East. There's certainly ethnocentric factors of Judeo-Christian versus Muslim, racial factors, cultural, who can speak English, all that and more. And the net effect, I think, particularly with a turning point after the 1967 war, where the U.S. has been joined at the hip with Israel. And the protracted so many decades of occupation and suppression of Palestinian human rights has, for the most part, just washed over the media and politics of the country as though irrelevant or okay. Certainly, there's been an improvement. There were efforts 30 or 40 years ago to start a couple of Jewish groups. I know the Progressive Magazine promoted back in the 1980s to oppose Israeli oppression of Palestinians. And those groups, noble as they were, really fizzled. They never got sizable. Whereas Jewish Voice for Peace is quite a high impact now with thousands of members. And we've seen in recent days and weeks large demonstrations for Palestinian rights from DC to New York to Sacramento and elsewhere. So that's encouraging. Doesn't change the fact that here we are in the latter days of 2023, and you have a bipartisan, if not consensus, very close to it on Capitol Hill, and you have a president unwilling, as we speak, to call for a ceasefire while thousands and thousands of civilians in Gaza have been slaughtered, and this is ongoing. That tells us a lot about the levels, the depths of moral depravity that help to guide U.S. foreign policy. And I think of, for instance, the willingness, eagerness to ship cluster weapons to Ukraine, where 18 months ago the White House was saying it may well have been a war crime that Russia was using in its invasion and immediately aftermath of it, cluster munitions in Ukraine. Fast forward to summer of 2023, all of a sudden it's fine for the U.S. to ship its massive inventory of cluster munitions to Ukraine. This is part of the Orwellian doublethink that is so standard. And of course, we can think of how Biden and Blinken, the former chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and the chief of staff of that committee, now Secretary of State Blinken, they cheerled, they helped push through with bogus hearings in the summer of 2002, helped to bring the Senate to approve the invasion of Iraq. And now we're hearing from them how it's absolutely unacceptable for what they call the rules-based order for Russia to have invaded Ukraine. It's really, we make the rules, we break the rules.
Thanks, Norman. And what you mentioned about cluster munitions also reminds me. So, Esther Brito Ruiz, my research assistant / collaborator for an article we have in Third World Quarterly that came out a few months ago. One of the things we found in comparing media coverage of in the New York Times of Yemen and Ukraine, we found in the situation with Ukraine and Russia that Russia's use of cluster munitions, as you mentioned, were condemned in a headline, were questioned their legality under international law. And then there was a later headline of Ukraine using cluster munitions against a village. And it said something like, to push back Russians, Ukraine uses cluster munitions in village or something like that. And one of the things we point out in the article is just how one is condemnatory and the other actually provides a rationale for their use. And something you mentioned earlier just about the Washington Post. I did some research on both New York Times and Washington Post coverage of drone strikes in the immediate aftermath, and I pointed out to someone in the editorial office for the Washington Post that, investigations, including those by the Bureau of Investigative Journalism, show that your reporting is inaccurate. Do you correct your reporting? And the person actually provided an answer in writing that said it's not their responsibility to do that. It would actually be the CIA's responsibility to correct the record. And it's like, the CIA is not even admitting to the strikes in Yemen because they're supposedly covert. And so just the way that, the Washington Post is and the New York Times, the way they either they defer, or I don't even know the best word to describe it. So I guess I'm wondering. You already talked a little bit about the role the media plays in all of this, but is the media, is it deferential? Is it stenographic? Are the reporters ignorant? Or is it self-interested? Is it all the above? And in exhibiting any of all these characteristics, how does it present in media coverage? I already maybe provided some examples, but how does this sort of bias present itself in media coverage of America's wars?
It's all the above, and I think it's a realm quite often where it's difficult to see a solid line between political analysis or media analysis and psychoanalysis. People have mortgages to pay. People want to rise in the profession. How they view this, I think, can vary quite widely in terms of these dynamics. I was lucky enough to become friends with Edward Herman, who I miss very much, who passed away a number of years ago, but who, among other things, co-wrote with Noam Chomsky the book Manufacturing Consent. And Ed used to say, there's no such thing as a sincerometer. It's really hard to measure exactly how sincere any particular political or media figure might be, but we do see the results, and we see through content analysis, the contradictions. And I think, as you're alluding to, Jeff, when these contradictions, maybe not to put too fine a point on it, often could be called lies, are called to the attention of journalists, the responses really vary. I think there's more of a wall that we hit the higher up in the media food chain we get. And it's maybe not much more difficult to get an audience with the Pope than an audience with the editor-in-chief of the New York Times or the Washington Post. They're just in their own elite circles. When we talk, for instance, about the contrast between coverage of Russian actions and what has been going on in Yemen since 2015, the U.S. providing all sorts of military, logistical, intelligence, and political support as the Saudi-led really massacres ongoing in Yemen have proceeded. The UN reporting 400,000 deaths there, massive killing of children, the largest cholera epidemic in modern history. And Jeff, I really appreciated the piece that you and Esther Brito Ruiz wrote published in August, how U.S. news coverage of wars in Yemen and Ukraine reveals bias in recording civilian harm. FAIR did a study, the Media Watch Group FAIR, looked at the data and found that during the ratings driven, or at least ratings beneficial coverage by MSNBC and Rachel Maddow in particular, year after year of so-called Russiagate, MSNBC devoted almost no airtime whatsoever while the Saudi-led killing continued in Yemen. And at one level, we might ask, well, gee, that's really odd. The United States was actually involved in supporting that ongoing massive killing in Yemen. At another level, we could say it's not only in spite of the U.S. government's involvement, it was arguably because of the U.S. government's involvement. The blood was on the hands of Uncle Sam, and that was a disincentive, especially with a Democrat in the White House after Biden came in. But even before that, the designated enemy was Russia. And of course, this was during Trump, way before the invasion of Ukraine. And that's where the overlay, I think, of sort of like the Venn diagram overlap of adherence to or deference to U.S. foreign policy, what's being said in Congress and the White House, narcissism of a jingoistic nature, racism, ethnocentrism, all of that overlaying together makes this so-called liberal network virtually ignore the U.S. role and the realities of the killing in Yemen. It's really quite stunning, and something that in the present day is virtually unremarked upon, and I try to mention it from time to time, is when I drive away from my house and go to work, and this is true for many people, I see Ukrainian flags displayed, which I think makes sense. Solidarity with the civilians being slaughtered. I can't find any Yemeni flags. I'm not aware of Yemeni flags being displayed, and that is a testament to the power of propaganda in our own country.
Yeah, this is something I've thought about and have talked about with others, including a Yemeni colleague, and got that same sense that other people who are suffering, especially as a direct correlation of U.S. foreign policy or even direct U.S. action, can feel like abandoned when we get behind certain causes and not others. But something you said earlier, Norman, about you used the word lies, made me think of just like the word terrorism has been politicized or given political meaning. I was thinking about how quote unquote fake news and disinformation also seem to have a political meaning rather than any actual meaning. Because I think about this, when the New York Times or the Washington Post reports things like I've referred to, um, and it's completely inaccurate. I mean, isn't that fake news also, or does fake news only apply to Russia's propaganda?
Well, a lot of layers, I think, that is borne out. We have, even going back to the invasion, say, of Iraq, it wasn't just Fox News and right wing media. Really, it was the liberal media that had more impact to clear away doubts. The New York Times, the reporting of Judith Miller and Michael Gordon, who's now reporting for Wall Street Journal on similar issues of foreign policy. But, yellow cake, uranium, aluminum tubes, just fantasies that were presented on the front page as facts would qualify as fake news. And in a political realm, finally, the mass media has started to say, and does say now, Donald Trump was telling lies. They would just call it, finally, lies. And that was a step forward. Unfortunately, it's sort of sequestered to him in terms of coverage. That there are lies happening so often that could be called that rather blunt word from members of the leadership of the House and Senate from both parties, and coming out of the Oval Office from Biden. But somehow now we're not supposed to have that happen in terms of being called for what it is, calling by its true name. I think, Jeff, a lot of what we're talking about really shakes out as part of paradigms that are long lasting. These are patterns, and it's certainly driven some of my more recent work in terms of writing and thinking about what are the prototypes that have endured. Yeah, the technology of making war has changed. There's the internet now, there's social media, et cetera, cable news that scarcely existed 40 years ago now has such an important role in driving the kind of media coverage we get on these issues. And yet there are these paradigms that have continued, that it's really important to identify and see how they persist.
Well, thanks, Norman. And taking that into consideration with your long record of research and writing, and again, taking into consideration the evolution of media and maybe government propaganda techniques, how have government and media approaches to America's wars evolved and changed?
It's sort of that cliche: the more things change, the more they stay the same. I think of the word shape-shifting, that these folks are shrewd who run the Pentagon, the PR operations of the State Department and the White House. They're attentive to what works, what doesn't, what used to work, what didn't work. While there may be very similar themes through the years and decades, the learning from experience, for instance, even going back to the Vietnam War, the so-called Vietnamization, in the last 3 years until the so-called peace treaty, so we're talking 69 to 72, President Nixon kept withdrawing troops from Vietnam. But the U.S. was dropping more bombs on Vietnam than ever. And the head of ABC News, for instance, sent out a memo. The story is not what's happening in Vietnam in any sort of combat or bombing operations. The story is that our troops are coming home. And while the United States government, taking a page from the first President Bush's gleeful statement that thank God we've kicked the Vietnam syndrome once and for all, as he put it, right after the bombing-driven Gulf War in 1991, the troops did go into Afghanistan. They did go into Iraq. On its own terms, the political system found that not a really satisfying result after many, many years in Afghanistan and almost as many in Iraq. But Raytheon and Boeing and Northrop Grumman, these huge military contractors, they never lose a war. But there have been constant adjustments being made, and I think in the last several years under the Biden administration, with the withdrawal of U.S. troops from Afghanistan, it's more than ever from the air. We're above it all. We send in the drones, we bomb, we have special operations forces through secret activities in many countries, joint military training, particularly in Africa, for instance, with the militaries in many, many countries. And so these are still, especially from a messaging and propaganda standpoint, very ongoing, very constant, and then applied, by extension, you could say, given the military support, as I note in the book, extraordinary commitment of 35 billion with a B dollars over a 10-year period, committed, locked in from the US to Israel, and now more being appropriated, staggering amounts of money for the Israeli military. And you could say, and the title of my book, War Made Invisible, has a subtitle, How America Hides the Human Toll of Its Military Machine. Arguably, the Israeli military is part of the U.S. military machine. It's certainly been funded and supplied that way. And then when I look at the table of contents of the book, many of these chapter titles, these themes of how the messaging for war, for the warfare state, all continues. It's completely applicable to the kind of messaging we're getting from the White House, from Congress, and from US media as the Israeli government is involved in just the wholesale slaughter of civilians in Gaza as we speak. For instance, these chapter titles sort of give an idea: repetition and omission, what's put in, what's left out, unintended deaths, how it spun that if predictably the US or the Israeli military kills civilians, the claim is it's unintended, even though it's completely predictable. The military commanders and their political bosses know full well that many, many civilians will die, and lives that really matter, lives that don't. Of course, that's not explicitly stated. It's a reality of U.S. foreign policy for many reasons and many techniques. And it's a reality of how not only how Israel is proceeding with its military actions, but how Biden and the so-called leadership in Congress try to justify what Israel is doing.
Thanks, Norman. And that brings me back to the title, War Made Invisible: How America Hides the Human Toll of Its Military Machine. And we got right into our conversation, but I do like to ask authors about the title and covers of their book. Were the things that you were just describing, or things we've already talked about, did this all go into how you came up with the title of your book? And because I'm thinking about some of the research on what some might describe as America's new way of making war, the sort of invisible or technological precision, all the adjectives, and nouns we can think of that are used to describe U.S. actions. And so when you say war made invisible, I assume that this does not refer to just recent technological advancement. So, what does "war made invisible" mean, and what does it refer to? And I'm sorry, I know you've already kind of got into this, but and also, did you contribute to the cover design of the book? And is that a image created or an actual image of bombs raining down?
The title really turned out to be the first words I wrote of the book, War Made Invisible. And initially, I thought of it as sort of a sequel title to a previous book I wrote that came out a couple of years after the invasion of Iraq, War Made Easy. As I thought about it, though, it's not just that there's more war, that it's continued, but that to some significant degree, and more in recent years, there's been a shift in the visibility, the awareness, the presentation of both those wars and the impacts at home. So, War Made Invisible seemed to me to capture a lot of those multi level realities. Part of it is, as we were talking about, fewer boots on the ground. So the air wars are almost by definition far less visible to the US public. So there are no scenes or very few scenes of the injured troops coming home, the loved ones grieving, all of that sort of drama, real life human drama that was so present in media and in politics during the combat of US troops in Afghanistan and Iraq. There's very little of that now. And there are special operations, there are occasionally Americans killed in combat in Syria or in Africa or elsewhere, but it's very low level. There's, in terms of media coverage, very little of that. At the same time, I think the increasing, to use an odd word, normality of war has had enormous effects. It's become, so to speak, the wallpaper on the media echo chamber. It's gone into the woodwork of the echo chamber, and so there's very little reason for people to be aware of the ongoing warfare or its effects. It's like the cliche. It's kind of like white noise or the fish in the water. What is water? We're used to it all the time. And then there's what Martin Luther King Jr. described not only as the madness of militarism, the atmosphere socially, but what he described as the demonic, destructive suction tube of funneling vast resources away from human needs to astronomical budgets. And so we have the Pentagon budget going through the roof every year, Congress giving more than Biden even asked for, which was an increase. And that's normal. So we really don't see it as anything worth talking about or raising our eyebrows about. From a media standpoint, it becomes the dog bites human story, not the human bites dog story. So it's just so normal. And yet the impacts are so huge. And even if there's reporting of what Chomsky and Herman called victims without victimizers, there's huge coverage of problems with healthcare, with the society falling apart, with education, so many different ways. But the connections are not made. And so the militarism, the spending on the military, which is so astronomical, the 850 billion with the B dollars annual Pentagon budget doesn't include other spending like nuclear weapons. So that is so normal that the connections between the lack of healthcare, education, housing, infant care, elderly care, end of life care, the environmental protection funding that's needed and lacking, the libraries that aren't open, the schools that are begging for funding, all this and more is going on. And the connections are invisible between that and massive military spending.
Thanks, Norman. And does the terms that we use also matter, or contribute to this, making the human toll invisible? And what I'm thinking about, is some of the euphemistic language. There's there's a genocide study scholar from, I think it was published probably early 80s, who said, war is an instrument of foreign policy. Genocide is the handmaiden of the totalitarian state. And so first there's this idea that war is normal, and that, Western democracies don't commit genocide, but they do occasionally engage in war. There's another scholar who talked about how, the importance of intent to the crime of genocide, and when Western states, as the quote unquote civilized states, engage in war, their goal is to avoid civilian casualties rather than than kill civilians. And that also then just reminds me of something Dirk Moses wrote in his book now, I guess it's about a couple years ago, on the problems of genocide, where he asks, a pretty straightforward, simple question. What is the experiential difference between a victim of genocide and someone who's quote unquote collateral damage? And so I guess I'm wondering where these euphemisms come in, and also this idea that some victims are more worthy than others, which of course does in some ways refer back to Herman and Chomsky's worthy and unworthy victims.
It's so routine, it's so built in, simply the magnitude, the volume, the tone, the tenor, the vividness or absence of all the above in media coverage of particular wars. And the echo effect back and forth between media and what the president is saying and prominent members of Congress, and they're reference points for each other, and they magnify each other's impacts and so forth. And what we've been discussing in terms of the biases come into play in terms of so-called national security priorities, the elites, what they have decided to emphasize or not, who matters, who doesn't, what lives matters, what don't, what bloody shirts to be waved, what to be ignored, and all of that. You're reminding me that through the history of the nuclear arms race, there was some assumption that because the United States had these strong elements or some elements of democracy, the US as a government would be more restrained in its role in the nuclear arms race compared to, say, the Soviet Union. And as the historians Roy and Zoris Medvedev wrote more than 40 years ago in The Nation magazine, that actually was not the case. As repressive as the Soviet Union was, they were not as irresponsible as the United States democracy in every step of the nuclear arms race. And arguably, that's been true to today. I mean, that's the ultimate genocide is nuclear weapons, of it's omnicide. And yet, the United States in this century has canceled the Open Skies Treaty, the INF, Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, the ABM Treaty. That has been done by Bush in terms of ABM, and then Open Skies and INF by Trump. And the Biden administration has basically done nothing to restore. I mean, all those three treaties, bilateral mostly with, in most cases, with Russia, with the Soviet Union, and now Russia, has have been killed by the U.S. And Biden and company don't bother to do anything about it, just letting this omnicidal arms race get worse and worse. And whether it's the word genocide or terrorism, I fear again it's a rhetorical football, and it is again an Orwellian zone. We ought to uh, prevent terrorism. We ought to prevent genocide. When we don't have a single standard of human rights, when we don't have a single standard of language, then it all becomes jumbled into manipulation. Imagery, of course, is important. The video we get, the photographs. I think, as I mentioned in my book, Susan Sontag has a good point that showing the suffering is important, but the frame, the assumptions behind the suffering um, can make a pivotal difference in how people even see a video or see a picture of suffering. Does it mean the United States should be more involved because people are already suffering? We need to get the job done. Or depending on the narrative and frame of mind, does it mean that this war needs to stop? And speaking of imagery, Jeff, I'm remembering that I didn't respond to the part of your question about the cover of this book. So I guess I ought to mention that. I'm a word person, so images don't come to mind first or second, but it does matter. And when I got the first iteration of a cover for War Made Invisible, it showed these weapons exploding in a dark sky, and underneath was sort of a uh, little boxes construction, like almost a monopoly game of little houses, suburban houses. And I thought, well, this doesn't really work because it seems like US suburbia is being bombed. So anyway, there was a back and forth, and finally came up with the current uh, cover, which does show what I believe are sort of tracers of bombs dropping from the sky, actual photograph that was adapted. And there's sort of a cloud coming down from them, beginning to make the words "war made" less visible. So it is sort of an imagery that way.
Okay. Thank you, Norman. And yeah, so I wanted to read, a couple excerpts, from your book before we finish up. And the first comes from page 34, and you write, quote, "No matter how sophisticated its high-tech weaponry, the large-scale Russian warfare in Ukraine was barbaric. That the same could also be said about American warfare in Afghanistan and Iraq was a truth nearly taboo to utter in U.S. mass media. Both the United States and Russia had brazenly flouted international law, crossing borders, and persisting with massive lethal force. As I, referred to a little earlier, my research collaborator Esther and I are working on the comparative study of political and media discourse on the U.S. invasion of Iraq and Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And part of its origin is in what I at least remember to be obvious differences in how these respective invasions have been discussed. So much of the discourse on Russia's invasion emphasizes the idea that for international law to have any meaning, the international order, international law, and so on, Putin must be held accountable. As you point out in your book, Bush has been, and this is the term I use here, but fully rehabilitated. Of course, there's the episode of Ellen that is commonly referred to, Bush being a painter now and sharing, candy with Michelle Obama and so on. What are your thoughts on the utility of international law and international institutions, at least as it comes to accountability for the United States?
It's a great idea, international law. It sort of reminds me of what we're told Gandhi was asked. Mahatma Gandhi was presented with the question, Mr. Gandhi, what do you think of Western civilization? And he replied, I think it would be a good idea. In the case of international law, I think it's very important. And as very flawed as the United Nations is, with so much power vested in the Security Council and so forth, and the General Assembly rendered fairly powerless, still the UN has the potential, and there's really a need. I mean, there's always been a fraud associated with, uh, if not always, maybe after World War II, not initially, but there's been routinely a fraud going back to the incredible racism and imperial preferences of Woodrow Wilson with the League of Nations, even though that was a good idea. But you have that mixture, and that's international diplomacy of really good ideas and imperatives and just out and out manipulation for maximum international leverage. Been of limited impact. I mean, the United States, unfortunately, normalized torture after 9/11, uh, made it much harder to restrict or give even an example to push back against torture by other regimes or reckless and cruel bombing of populations. The U.S. has set the pace. To not be a member of the ICC, the International Criminal Court, and yet to demand that some foreign leaders be brought to justice for war crimes. There was a lot of fear that, for instance, in Britain, I even heard the BBC discussing it, that Tony Blair might need to worry about traveling overseas because what happened to the fascist dictator from Chile, Augusto Pinochet, might happen to him. And there was some fear that Henry Kissinger had, but there needs to be the enforcement, and of course that's been tough. So I think the ideal of international law is really something to strive for if it can be um, uniformly rather than hypocritically implemented.
Thanks, Norman. I'm wondering what you think about are things like people's tribunals. I mean, you could look at Vietnam. There have been different ones for the Bush administration, and others beyond that as well, including some I believe in a Latin American context. Um, are these do these serve anything more than a symbolic purpose?
I think they're worth trying. The famous Bertrand Russell Tribunal during the Vietnam War. Russell, he was one of the towering figures of integrity, and he was, of course, vilified and so forth. But the Russell Tribunal really helped to expose what the U.S. was doing in Vietnam. I think of the Vietnam Veterans Against the War organization and the Winter Soldier investigation and hearings that occurred in the United States toward the tail end of the Vietnam War, also very important. And there have been a number of efforts going on. As a matter of fact, uh, this autumn there are there's a tribunal effort that's going to examine the role of military contractors. I always try to remind people they're not defense contractors, they're military contractors. And putting on trial places like Raytheon. Of course, we don't have any enforcement uh, technique or possibility, but I think it's something in the toolkit that can be used well.
Thanks, Norman. And going back again to the title of your book, what are the costs of war? And many might immediately think about the material costs. I know there was the Iraqi body count project with the invasion of Iraq, and we do commonly at least try to keep track of or calculate the number of people whose lives are lost. But the other human costs must also be accounted for. And so, what are these often invisible costs of war? I know you mentioned the historic. For that's almost sounds like it's a good thing, but the cholera outbreak in Yemen. Other than the deaths associated with the use of force, what are the human costs of wars in the U.S. From starvation, preventable disease, and so on?
Overseas, we get very little discussion at home about those costs. Often the U.S. Directly or indirectly responsible for the destruction of infrastructure, sanitation, decimation of the social fabric, the trauma, the PTSD, what has been done to people psychologically, uh, terrorized. And then when we look at what's happening in the United States, what are the effects of having literally millions of men trained to learn how to kill and they come home? You take the men out of the military. Do you take the military out of the men? Well, maybe in most cases, but there is a proclivity of violence. I cite in the book studies showing much more domestic violence from veterans and especially combat veterans. The effect of PTSD at home, tremendous effects. The acculturation to violence in general. You might say the moral and spiritual corrosion, what comes through in the media, what happens when people come home and they can't shake their own memories. What about the Pentagon's 1033 program that provides gratis military equipment and weaponry to police forces around the country? Black Lives Matter protesters were facing off against Pentagon weapons that had been provided for free to police forces around the country. The militarization just has so many different dimensions to it. And it brings me back to what Martin Luther King Jr. called the madness of militarism. This is just unacceptable to address among the elites in Congress, the person in the White House, mass media in general. Militarism is not confronted, it's embraced when it's U.S. militarism.
Thanks, Norman. And as we're getting closer to the end here, I want to ask you I guess it's maybe a fairly large question. Is the U.S. still at war? Whether officially or unofficially, is the quote unquote war on terror still active? Some might point to the 1980s during Reagan as being the last time the U.S. was not at war, but there was, if we're going to say that, there were definitely numerous adventures, if you will. So for you, when was the last time the U.S. was not at war? I know that's a few questions tied together, but
Sure. Well, Reagan was maybe dealing with the uh, so-called Vietnam syndrome, but still gearing up. Invasion of Grenada, 1983. Invasion of Panama, a bigger morsel for the imperial appetite, 1989 under the first President Bush. So they were gearing up. You could sort of see it on a graph. Vietnam War, tremendous, as Nick Turse and others have documented, tremendous firepower, murderous from the skies, killing several million people in Southeast Asia. And then you had this lull under Carter. And then we had this gear up, a little island, 83, Panama, 89, the Gulf War, a tremendous leap forward in militarism and slaughter from the air. The Pentagon saying in 6 weeks, 100,000 Iraqi people killed in early 1991. Ticker tape parade, Norman Schwarzkopf, Colin Powell, 1989 or 1999 under President Clinton, 78 straight days of bombing, U.S.-led bombing of Kosovo and Yugoslavia by NATO, not a single American killed. Glorious, according to Bill Clinton and mass media, triumph of the U.S. And then, of course, into the so-called war on terror, Afghanistan, Iraq, and Yemen, Syria, Somalia, many other countries. As we speak, towards the end of 2023, according to the Cost of War Project at Brown University, at the same time that Biden was telling the world at the UN 2 years ago that the United States was no longer at war, the United States was involved in the so-called war on terror in 85 countries with all sorts of counterinsurgency and joint efforts with other militaries, drone strikes, bombings, special operations. It's a illusion and a delusion that U.S. mass media on the whole really play into, that the United States isn't at war. As a matter of fact, I quote in the book a report from Reuters news service a year or so ago saying that Biden was presenting a peacetime budget. That was their term, the news service. It's a peacetime budget. The United States was at war in many countries, but it's become so normalized that it's we're sort of anesthetized to it, and we're not really far from War is Peace from 1984, Orwell's sort of formulation of the ultimate doublethink that we're at war, but we're not at war. It's really at peace. This is shifting, though, because of the Ukraine war and now the war in the Middle East, the United States more and more active, and all the more reason for pushback by people who don't want to go along with the madness of militarism.
thanks, Norman. And I think that, in its way brings us to the last question, which, in some ways refers also back to the question about, fighting apathy. As we conclude, you quote James Baldwin in your final sentence of your book, quote, "Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it's faced." What does this mean to you in the context of your book? And, in the face of, political and media propaganda, will we ever truly face that which needs to be changed?
It's certainly a challenge, individually in the society in a huge way. And often I think of mass media as a de facto fog machine. What do media outlets, mass media, generally tell us to do? Well, they tell us to go out and buy things, and that includes NPR and PBS and so forth, ostensibly non-commercial, and to maybe go out and vote once in a while. And for all the reasons we've been discussing for the last hour, the fog really obscures the realities of U.S. foreign policy and what they mean to people, human beings overseas, and really here at home. The poet William Stafford wrote that every war has two losers. And certainly the people at the end of U.S. firepower, they are by far the biggest losers. Those at the end of weapons coming from anywhere that are being fired. At the same time, our own society in the United States is so undermined, so corrupted. Our view of the world and our ability to make well-focused assessments of what our priorities really are and what they should be, it's very corrosive in terms of what is actually our status quo. So we have the opportunity and the challenge, and as always, it's difficult to do what's most worthwhile. Really, as I think Noam Chomsky has said very clearly when asked, "Hey, what difference does all this make?" He said, I think, quite astutely, it's true, we could put all of our energy, all of our lives into changing this or that, and we might have no effect. But if we don't strive to make a better world happen, for sure we won't help that to occur.
Thank you, Norman. Yeah, one thing I tell my students is, especially when feel how or see how challenging all of this is, and how much energy and how exhausting it can be, that especially at the local level, if you change one person's life in some way for the better, then you've made a difference. And I think thinking small, and then sort of like rippling outward, can help people kind of not feel like what they're doing has no meaning or isn't having an impact. So thank you. This has been a sobering conversation, but one that I've greatly enjoyed. And so thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks a lot, Jeff.
And before I do let you go, is there anything that you're working on right now that our listeners can keep their eye out for, whether it's another book or anything else you're writing?
Well, I'm trying to write hopefully useful articles about the current conflict in Gaza and Israel and the Middle East, as well as about what's happening in Ukraine. And so those articles are running often on Common Dreams and other websites.
Okay, great. For those, commondreams.org, if you're looking there. And thanks again, Norman, and take care.
You too, and thanks for all you're doing.